Southeast Asia, the fourth largest market in the world, has gradually become a hotspot in geopolitics. In November 2020, China and 14 Asia-Pacific nations signed a trade deal, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. In May 2022, the US hosted the US-ASEAN Summit at the White House, inviting 10 leaders from the ASEAN region. Later, President Joe Biden launched the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework along with 13 other countries. How does the US side view this competition, and how important is Southeast Asia to the US? Let's hear what US Ambassador to Singapore David Adelman has to say. As a Democrat, what do you think of US foreign policy in Southeast Asia under the Trump administration in terms of national security and economy? Some people predict that Trump will win the presidential election again in 2024. Do you think Trump will continue with the same policy, and what might this lead to?
So Trump's foreign policy, especially in Southeast Asia, was very different from that during the Obama administration. I was very fortunate to serve as the U.S. ambassador in Singapore at a time when the sort of primary, or I suppose the signature foreign policy initiative of the Obama administration was the so-called pivot to Asia, or the rebalancing to Asia as it later became described. It was the effort and the interest in President Obama in sort of taking America out of the wars in the Middle East and turning America's attention to the most dynamic and growing markets in the world, which were all in East Asia and many important markets in Southeast Asia. Now, look, events have a way of, overtaking even the best policies, wars, conflict, and the like. The Trump administration, for reasons that are really hard to explain, decided, not to continue with the pivot to Asia and to really de-emphasize America's alliances all around the world, but in particular to more directly confront China, and as part of its confrontation to China, in my view, to not give enough attention to friends, partners, and allies of the United States in Southeast Asia.
Look at that. Isn't that nice?
Now, with regard to, prognostication about, American elections, I suppose Donald Trump continues to be a political force in American politics and may very well run again for president in 2024. I don't think anyone could responsibly predict what the outcome of a U.S. presidential election might be more than 2 years from now. I can say that I expect if he does run a national campaign, or even if he steps back and lets others in effect act as a proxy for his politics, I think he will again be very hawkish towards China, will promote the politics of confrontation with China. And I don't see any indication that he's going to revisit some of the alliance building and friendship building in Southeast Asia that we saw during the Obama term. I think he will be mostly focused on China and probably issues arising from Russia's invasion of Ukraine will also be a big part of the foreign policy discussion in the American national campaign. It's an interesting question as to sort of where that will leave his opponent. Let's assume it's President Biden running for a second term. If it's President Biden running for a second term, I think he'll also be in a position to, in some ways, match some of this idea of confronting China. Certainly will emphasize America's role in supporting Ukraine and building and strengthening NATO, especially with the recent decisions from Finland and Sweden to join the NATO alliance. But I'm hopeful that the Biden administration will continue to develop the sort of more nuanced foreign policy that is required to reassure America's friends and partners in Southeast Asia.
Recently, President Joe Biden has met with ASEAN leaders at the White House, touting new initiatives that are worth $150 million. China, on the other hand, is deepening its economic ties with ASEAN countries as well. It seems both countries are competing for dominance in this region. How important are ASEAN countries for the US strategically, and how important is it for the US to win this game?
Yeah. Well, I don't think of it as winning and losing. I don't think of international relations as, a zero-sum competition where if one country wins, then it must come at the expense of another country. I think the rising tides can lift all boats. And I think there are many leaders in Beijing and Washington that sort of also see the world that way. In some ways, the countries in Southeast Asia, the ASEAN countries, are in a very strong position, right? Their sort of neutrality has served them very well. The United States has been the guarantor of security in the region. The powerful rise of the Chinese economy has promoted prosperity in the region. And I think at the very sort of highest level, at the macro level, you could say that the ASEAN countries have been beneficiaries of China's economic rise and America's continued undergirding of security. It's not a surprise that both countries want to sort of deepen and strengthen their relationships in the region. What I think ASEAN countries are rightfully mindful of is choosing sides. And I think it would be a mistake for the United States to force a choice on ASEAN countries, force a hard choice, make it about, either pick Beijing or pick Washington. You can't have it both ways. I think would be a mistaken foreign policy. And I do not think that is the foreign policy of the Biden administration. I worry that should Trump or a Republican follower of Trump ascend to the White House, that they might move back into that zero-sum game type of foreign policy and force choices on friends and allies in Southeast Asia. I think that would be a mistake. I think that leaders in the capitals in Southeast Asia are privately advising both Washington and Beijing against setting themselves up against each other so directly. We'll see how it unfolds. Thank you.
How important is Singapore in the Sino-US game, and what are the biggest interests of US and China in Singapore?
Well, I'm partial to Singapore. I think Singapore is, an extremely important place. Singapore, now really since its founding, for more than 50 years, has been an important friend and now strategic partner of the United States. It has been a country with whom the United States military has enjoyed great interoperability and access with hundreds of U.S. naval vessels visiting Singapore's Changi Naval Base every year. The United States Air Force enjoying access to Singaporean Air Force facilities. A huge number of Singaporean military training every year in the United States. Exchange of technology, weapons sales, intelligence, all that goes along with a very strong security partnership. American and I suppose Western multinational corporations have found Singapore to be a very hospitable home for their regional headquarters. They've now, for decades, have had important decision makers located in Singapore. The U.S.-Singapore Free Trade Agreement that was negotiated during the Bill Clinton administration, ultimately signed by President George W. Bush, has served both economies very well. So it's a very strong U.S.-Singapore economic partnership and U.S.-Singapore security partnership. That being said, China also has had very strong relations with Singapore. Singapore, I think, is the largest or one of the largest foreign investors in China. Singapore has very, very strong economic relations in China. Singapore, I think, continues to develop security partnerships with the Chinese, and it's a great example, I think, of what we talked about in your previous question, which is Singapore has, I think, very effectively resisted being forced into a choice between Beijing and Washington, and has done quite well navigating what at times have been very tricky waters across the Pacific. Singapore, I think, is recognized as being somewhat aligned with the West and with the United States on some of the most important issues, especially security issues. But I think if you were to ask decision makers in Beijing, they would tell you that their relationship with Singapore is very constructive and very positive. The role tiny Singapore plays, I think, is outsized in many ways. It's often said that Singapore punches above its weight. I find that to be very much true. And I think Singapore, going back to its founding with Lee Kuan Yew, and now, under the many years of leadership of Lee Hsien-loong, that it has been an effective, in some ways, intermediary. I don't want to quite use the word broker, but intermediary between Washington and Beijing. It's a country that understands China very well, very deeply, and I think understands the West and the United States very well. I can tell you, when I was leading the U.S. Embassy in Singapore, we found advice and insight from the government officials in Singapore, including Lee Kuan Yew, who was the minister mentor at the time and very much active in the government. We found those insights to be very useful, and oftentimes some of those opinions and insights were provided to U.S. decision makers at the highest level, including the President of the United States. So I can tell you Barack Obama is very informed by information and insight from Singapore. I'm sure that is now the case with Joe Biden and Secretary Antony Blinken at the State Department, as well as throughout the U.S. government.